So if you saw my email on Saturday or Friday or whenever it was I sent it out, we have one of our very own for guest speaker this morning, Sara Hanna. This goes back to when we were reconstituting this group at the beginning of this year. Kind of the core of us doing that, we're coming up with the idea that if we couldn't line up an external speaker, there were a bunch of topics that some of us individually might feel interested in talking about to fill in. And since Sarah's been working her entire career in environmental science, she's got a lot she can share with us. So I think we can probably dispense with our normal introductions, other than Sarah giving a little brief bio of the working part of her career. So I'll turn it over. Oh, in honor, check out our window. We are now Sarah and Doug, not Doug and Sarah. Sarah's principal speaker.
Sarah's name is on the left, but Sarah is on the right, just if anybody has any.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, right. I'll move off the screen. So take it away, Sarah.
All right. So I did speak to this group. I think a lot of you were probably on the call. I spoke a while ago about PFAS. That was really local focus. So today I'm zooming way out and hope I'll be able to rein it in enough not to be wandering on just a look at what's gone on in the environmental world, regulatory wise, over the past 50 or so years, which blows my mind that we've been at this for half a century and still got a lot to do. So just a quick background on why I felt like I could give this talk. I've been retired about 4 years now, but before that, I spent my entire career working in the hazardous waste site assessment and cleanup business. I was a licensed site professional, which is my educational background is in geology and hydrogeology. Undergrad from Wellesley and master's from BU. And so I spent my career doing this hazardous waste site cleanup and assessment, predominantly in Massachusetts, but during the last few years of my career, most of what I did was actually third-party review of other people's reports, and those were from all over the United States, which was really fascinating to get a look at how different states deal with things. So as I say, I was a licensed site professional, which the Commonwealth of Massachusetts privatized the waste site cleanup program in the early 90s. So I was in the first wave of people to get licensed. It's akin to like a professional engineering license or something. It was to be a waste site cleanup professional. I'll get into the Massachusetts program in a little more detail. But anyway, so kind of what I wanted to do was kind of a really high level overview of how regulating environmental issues has progressed over the last half century, given both the time frame I'm talking about and also my personal expertise. This is going to focus more on sort of the pollution aspects of being concerned about the environment, not so much directly on climate change issues, although there is some overlap and some synthesis and so forth. And just in the format of this, I've oftentimes the way we work here is Coffee with a Purpose is the speaker goes, gives a brief presentation and then there's discussion, which is kind of what I plan to do. But in the meantime, if anybody has any questions, feel free to jump in. This is as much a group discussion as anything else. So just a really quick timeline. In the 1960s, there started being concern, and looking around the call, we're all of a certain age, probably many of us remember a lot
Except
of this.
For Brinley, she's the
Except
spring
for
chicken.
Brinley, she's our youthful one.
I heard that.
Sorry, Brinley.
It's okay. I'll actually take it because in all of my other groups, I'm way old. So.
Yep. When we went on vacation to Alaska a couple of years ago, and we were the oldest ones on some of the guided hikes and what have you. But then there were this whole older demographic that was just on tour buses, and when we were around them, we're like, oh, we're not old yet. But anyway, So, there was Rachel Carson publishing Silent Spring about DDT causing all kinds of problems. There was the Cuyahoga River catching on fire. There were pictures of Los Angeles where the sky was yellow instead of blue because there was so much smog. And the first Earth Day happened in April of 1970. And in getting ready to do this talk, I was flabbergasted, given our political gridlock today. I was on the EPA website and they have a timeline of the EPA. And it said that I think it was like January of 1970, President Nixon gave a speech to Congress laying out, hey, we've got trouble with the environment, folks, we got to do something. They created a commission to look into what that should be. They recommended in like April that the EPA be created. And in December of 1970, the first administrator was sworn in. And that, given how long it takes us to push anything through Congress today, that was striking to me, that they got the whole thing from concept to creation in less than a year. And interesting that it was under a Republican administration, because today we have the Republicans are the ones that are more likely to be trying to rein the EPA in, but they were the ones that created the agency. So enough politics. So some of the very early things that EPA did, they created the Clean Air Act to look at air pollution, Clean Water Act that was predominantly focused on surface water. Most of what I did in my career was focused on groundwater, but at the time there was this view that groundwater was safe or groundwater was clean. And it was very obvious that surface water wasn't clean when you had rivers catching on fire. And when I was a child, I remember going to I honestly don't remember where we were going. Would go somewhere periodically with my cousins, but what I do remember is that before we got to I think it was the North Dashaway River, we would take bets of like, not serious bets, but just try to guess, what color will the river be today? Will it be blue? Will it be purple? Will it be green? Because there was a paper mill, and whatever color paper they were making that day, that's what color the river would be. So surface water was absolutely clearly a problem, and people didn't get into worrying about groundwater for a while yet. So I want to take a little sidestep into like 2 minute lesson of chemistry. Because some of what I'm talking about does come down to needing at least a real basic understanding of chemistry. I promise I'll keep it simple for those of you who aren't into science. But broadly, in dealing with pollutants, there are two broad categories. There's organic and inorganic. And inorganic things are things that, well, let me step the other way. Organic things is a very broad definition, are molecules that have hydrogen and oxygen and carbon, but primarily hydrogen and carbon are what define organic. Come back to them in a sec, but the inorganics are things like metals and salts and things that basically you can't easily transform them into something else. So if you have lead or if you have arsenic, you can't biodegrade lead into something that's not containing lead. It just, unless you have a nuclear reactor on hand, or an atom, the CERN reactor or a CERN, I don't know. You can't, metals don't go away. Whereas organic things can be turned from one into another through a whole bunch of different processes. And so, until very recently in human history, there were only naturally occurring organic materials. And because they evolved with everything else on the planet over long periods of time, there evolved ways of creating them and ways of breaking them down into something else, and something else that was not toxic to everything around it, except in extremely unusual conditions, such that the ecosystem could just go on renewing itself and we didn't have buildups of various things that you couldn't get rid of. And starting in about the 1940s, there was some of it being technology that came out of World War II, and some of it just being people learning more stuff. People were beginning to learn on an industrial scale to manipulate chemicals and create gazillions of new chemicals that had not existed before. And the reason that this is something that can be done and why there are so many chemicals. I don't know if you remember when I did my PFAS talk, there are thousands of PFAS compounds, and that's just one class of compounds. So one thing I think it's really important to understand is why are there so many of these things? And if you go back to, I think an easy model to think of is, I think probably everybody's seen Tinker Toys, the little kids' toys, where there is a central round disc that has many holes in it, and then different rods of different colors and different lengths that you can attach to those holes, and then attach other round discs and make a vast number of different creations. And that's a good basic model for organic chemistry, with the round discs being carbon atoms. Carbon atoms have basically four attachment points. And from there, you can attach another carbon atom. One of those attachment points can be another carbon atom, and then you can attach stuff to that. And if you multiply that out, if you've got 20 carbon atoms, you can see that there could be many different ways you could arrange them and different things you could add on. And as I say, it's kind of a simplistic model, but the point being that because of the way carbon atoms are structured, you can build vast numbers of different things with using them as your framework or your skeleton, including you can add things onto them that aren't added on in nature. So the back to the PFAS for a second, there are fluorine atoms that have been substituted in for, what in an ordinary molecule might have been a hydrogen atom. And you substitute, so you can put all these things on there that
I'll do it.
it sounds like a crisis. You can put all kinds of things on there that nature doesn't really know how to deal with, because you're sort of throwing a new chemical into the system, and there has not been a process evolved that efficiently breaks it down. And that's, as I say, super oversimplified, but just that's kind of the issue we deal with trying to deal with pollutants, is that we've learned to make all kinds of things in large quantities that nature is varyingly good at dealing with. Actually, things like petroleum spills, in my world, in the groundwater world, soil contaminated just with petroleum actually wasn't that huge a deal, because there are microbes that know how to eat petroleum molecules. And over time, petroleum concentrations in soil will go down naturally. Where you get into a problem is where you have so much that you overwhelm the bacteria, then it could be more of a problem. So that's enough chemistry for now, unless anybody has any questions about that. So I say super basic, but so over the 50 or so years that we've been having environmental regulations, and just again, to step back on why am I focusing on regulations? It's because the vast number of people will not go to the expense of not polluting things if nobody's making them do it. So, the driver of the cleanups that have happened have been regulated, the regulatory programs. It's not something that the average person will go out of their way to do if they don't have to. So there's all kinds of regulatory programs. I mean, I remember going to a talk at work years ago just on Massachusetts regulations. An attorney had come in to kind of do what I'm doing here, but give us a sort of an overview of something. And he was listing out all the regulations that you would have to, just environmental regulations, you would need to comply with and potentially get permits for if you wanted to put in a big development. And it was like a 2-page list just of different regulatory programs that you would have to go through. So there's a lot. And so again, this kind of raises the question, why? Why do we have so many environmental regulations? And so there's 2 pieces of the puzzle. There's all the different things we can regulate. So there's air and there's surface water, and those were kind of the 2 sort of the low-hanging fruit, effectively. Those were the first 2 things that EPA took a shot at. And within the air piece, they looked at a major source of air pollution was emissions from cars. So they looked at tailpipe emissions, but that was sort of a subset of air pollution. But there's soil, there's groundwater, there's wetlands, and then there's the materials themselves you're trying to regulate. There's pesticides, there's insecticides, there's herbicides, there's, a gazillion classes of chemicals. And you put all that together and you're already up to dozens of combinations that you can look at. And so you have the federal system, and the EPA is regulating all kinds of things. And then the states also have regulations, and state regulations are, being 50 states, they're all different. So if you are a company that does business in multiple states, you need to be complying with Connecticut laws in Connecticut and Massachusetts laws in Massachusetts. And they're, at least around here, the spirit of them is the same, but they may not accomplish things exactly the same. And if you go to Alabama, it may be very different, because at the state level is where you will start to see kind of a red state, blue state difference in how they regulate things. So again, this all, like in my career, when I started out in the early 1980s, very few of these regulations that we have today, very, very few of them existed. And it truly was like the Wild West, that we were kind of making it up as we went along because it hadn't been done before. We were creating our own field sampling equipment and figuring out where the different kinds of chemicals came from. And it was a blast, honestly. I loved it.
I've got a question. If the regulations didn't exist, does that also mean that standards didn't exist? How did you decide how clean did something need to be?
That I could have put him in as a ringer. So that's a really good question. And the way my company got involved, we were one of the early people. And the company I worked for, GZA, was started as a geotechnical engineering company. You may have heard their name. They were the ones that were doing the dam repair design here in town. So they started as a geotechnical engineering company. They had expertise in looking at things underground because they would do foundation engineering primarily. If somebody was building a skyscraper in Boston, they would bring in GZA to look at the subsurface conditions and figure out how the foundation needed to be designed so the building wouldn't fall over. So the town of Acton had a problem with its groundwater wells, and we were hired to look into that. There is a W.R. Grace facility in Acton, and it turned out that it was Grace that had their contamination had gotten into the town wells. And we were hired to kind of figure that out and to find a replacement water supply for the town of Acton. So that was one of my very first field jobs, was working on this area that we had identified as a potential water site. But so we were being driven really not by a regulation in this case, but by we can't drink the water, help, was kind of how we got involved. And the idea was the existing water supply was just going to be not permanently abandoned necessarily, but couldn't be used for some period of time in the time frame of years as opposed to weeks or months. And so they needed an alternative supply. But the how clean is clean question is a very good one. in Massachusetts, in 1983, they passed a regulation, Massachusetts Law, Chapter 21E, which basically says if you own a contaminated piece of property, whether you put the contamination there or not, you own the problem. And they said, so like if you buy a piece of land that's contaminated, even though you didn't buy it, and I'm talking commercial property, you could own you owned the problem, you had to clean it up. And if you couldn't afford to clean it up, this was the kicker, the state could clean it up for you and send you a bill up to triple damages. And that put a lien on the property ahead of the bank's mortgage interest. So it was a very, very large hammer that the state of Massachusetts came in with to make people assess and clean up properties. But the problem was there were no standards. There was nothing that said if you have 10 parts per billion, you need to report it and clean it up. But if you have 8, you're okay. So what was happening was when a piece of property would change hands, it wasn't the state requiring any of these studies. It was the lenders, it was the finance industry who was afraid of losing their shirt on a piece of contaminated property. And they would say before, it's kind of like how you might get your house inspected before the bank will send out an appraiser to see if your loan you want to get is, is this house worth a $400,000 loan or whatever. So the banks required these assessments to be done. And people like me, having no guidance as to what was a problem, if we found pretty much anything, we'd say, well, you probably, to be safe and to be conservative, you probably should report this to the state, even though we don't think it's truly a problem necessarily, that it's going to hurt anybody. But because we don't know what the state has in mind, because they haven't said, then you better report it. And so people did, and the state got inundated with these reports, thousands and thousands of them. And what was happening was that the state was overwhelmed. And so once a report went into them, people didn't want to do anything with the property until they got an okay letter from the state. Once you get a letter from the state saying, we've looked at your report and we don't think it's a problem, or we've looked at your report and it is a problem, go clean it up. But until you got that letter, there was all this uncertainty. And people didn't want to go forward because the business community, the finance community does not like uncertainty. If they have to choose between a situation where they need to spend at least some amount of money versus maybe we won't have to spend anything but we might have to spend a lot, they will take the spending money over the uncertainty up to obviously up to a certain amount of money, but uncertainty makes them crazy. And so many properties were just languishing. They weren't being developed, they weren't being sold, they weren't doing anything. People were saying, well, I don't want to buy this industrial property in Boston that might have a problem. I'll go out into the suburbs where there's forest and nothing has been built on it before, and I'll buy that land because that's safer. So you had this flight of development and of industry into virgin land and out of the city, and these industrial properties getting abandoned. And by the late 80s, the state was understanding that this was a problem. They did issue some standards, but eventually they totally privatized the program. And this was there was this huge push broadly in government to privatize all kinds of things. And one of the things that got privatized was the waste site cleanup process. And they created this new licensing of professional position called a licensed site professional. And there was, it's like any other professional licensing program that you might have to go through. There was an education requirement, a personal reference requirement, a professional references. You had to show your transcripts from school. You had to pass an 8-hour exam. There was, all kinds of stuff that went into it. And once you were designated a licensed site professional, you were delegated the authority by the state to provide an opinion as to whether a site had been, whether it was done or not, basically, whether it had been reached a condition of what in the parlance of the state was called no significant risk. And I know I still haven't gotten to the question of how clean is clean, but I'm getting there. Because this actually feeds into kind of the whole rest of what I was going to say anyway. And within the regulations, there is a requirement that you do a risk characterization to determine whether a site poses a condition of no significant risk. And it's very numerical, and there are all kinds of numbers and standards. And depending on the complexity, on a simpler site, you just basically compare what you've got at your site, concentrations of chemicals, to a list. And if you have less than all the different concentrations, you're good. But there are some sites where it's more complicated than that. If you have multiple different things that are contaminated with multiple different chemicals and different ways people might be exposed, there are these numerical, they get increasingly complicated. And again, I don't want to get into the weeds of the details, but basically what it comes down to is you come up with an assessment of, does this provide a condition of no significant risk? And it's defined in the regulations based on if you have carcinogenic chemicals, it's a risk level. Now I'm going to space on the numbers because they're different in the state and the federal systems and in different state systems. I believe, oh, I can't believe I'm forgetting this. I believe it's an excess one cancer in 100,000 people, but it might be 1 in a million. The state is one way and the feds are a different way. But one of them is 1 in 100,000, one is 1 in 100 million. I mean, in 1 million. And that means, is it, through lots of math and statistics, likely, possible? Again, when you get down to the real specifics, it's all based on some numbers and so forth. But could this site create an extra case of cancer that wouldn't have been there? An extra case in 1 out of 100,000 or 1 out of 1 million people. And it's just basically an arbitrary benchmark of the risk posed by this site. And if they're non-cancer causing chemicals, there's another risk index that gets used. But the question that people really choke on when they hear this discussion is, why isn't it zero? Why do we tolerate any risk at all? Why don't we clean it all up? And why are we even willing to get down to some level that isn't zero and say that's good enough? And kind of a way that I found sometimes people would find helpful, that they'd say, what do you mean? Oh, because the other piece of this is there are different standards for residential versus commercial property. So a residential property needs to be clean to a higher standard of clean. And you can leave more stuff in the ground at a commercial property.
Because of the presence of children?
Because of the presence of children, of course. No,
I thought that was true.
But at a commercial property, you don't have children typically. If you do, like a daycare center, then you need to account for that. But your standard commercial property that probably has a paved parking lot and people only there 8 hours a day, and people not digging in the dirt and not growing vegetables and eating them out of the garden out front and that kind of stuff, the state allows you to leave more contamination in the ground. And so one way that I've kind of thought of explaining to people this how clean is clean and why isn't it all just clean. So all my kids are grown now, but when they were teenagers, if I would say to my teenage kids, go clean your room, they would maybe throw some dirty socks in the hamper, kind of hoe a path to the bed, throw out a few pieces of trash, maybe put a couple of books on the shelf, and they'd say it was clean, because to them it was clean enough. If I was going to have people over for dinner, I would clean up the clutter in my house and dust and vacuum and run the dishwasher, and I'd say my house is clean enough. If I'm going to go to the hospital and have surgery, in the operating room, I certainly hope that they have sterilized everything and wiped it all down and, you know, made sure that there's no trash and the whole bit, and that's clean enough. If I'm Intel and I'm making chips, I need to have everybody wear masks and hair nets when they come in the room, and I have to have filtration on the room, and I have to do all this stuff, and that's how clean it needs to be. So clean really does depend on the use of the land. And as I say, that is a hard concept that people struggle with. So I'm just trying to look through my list of things I wanted to hit on here. So I guess, you know, pretty soon open it up for questions and discussion. I think I see Bill has a question.
No, is that a question or applauding?
Yeah, sorry, I hit the wrong button.
Oh, okay.
Sarah, I think another important point that you haven't said yet is that the cost of remediation goes exponentially higher the higher you try to clean too.
Yes.
So getting it 1 part per million might cost you $1 million. 1 part per 10 million might cost you $1 billion. So
Yeah,
that has to play in as well.
That's very true. That's very true. And in some cases, the technology does not exist, you know,
Right.
to get down to certain levels, you know. And in fact, when there is a there so the question comes up, well, I'm in the state system or I'm in the federal system, you know, I've reported my site, I'm going through the process of assessment and evaluation and cleanup. How do I know when I'm done? Well, when you're done is when you reach this condition of no significant risk that I mentioned. But sometimes it can take years and years and years to get there. And sometimes, as Bill says, you could get there if you had $10 billion to spend on, you know, a 2-acre property, you'd cart everything off and incinerate it down to bedrock or something, but that's just not a reasonable thing to expect is going to happen. So there are the different regulatory programs, both the Superfund program and the Massachusetts program, and other states also have similar things. In the Massachusetts system, for example, when you reach this condition of no significant risk, it's stated that you have reached a permanent solution. But you can also reach what's called a temporary solution, which is essentially, we've done as much as we can do right now. We know we're not done. Either we're working on it. So that can happen, for example, if you have a groundwater treatment system, you know, like our PFAS system that the town put in, that's going to be running for a long time. It's not like you just turn it on, run it, and then you're done. It's going to be going and going and going. And the town is at the point now where they've done what they can, and they're going to keep doing it, but they're not at a point where they could just turn the system off permanently and say we're still good. So if you have a site where either your treatment system is running and it's doing its job, but it's just going to take a long time, or in some cases where you just can't even afford to touch it. If you've got heavy levels of contamination 100 feet down in the ground, you may just not be able to, you know, there are situations where there's actual pure solvent that is denser than water and goes all the way down till it hits something impermeable like rock. And because the rock surface is uneven, you've got little pools of it all over the place. To be able to find those and suck them all up and deal with them is just wildly impractically expensive. So there are these conditions wherein you would be at a temporary solution, but you can't just say I'm at a temporary solution and stop. Every 5 years you need to do a reevaluation and look and see, maybe some new technology has come along. Maybe something has changed such that I can do some more, or maybe my treatment system can be shut, you know, whatever it is, always with the goal of getting to that permanent solution. So yeah, but you're absolutely right, Bill, that the cost of these things can be mind-blowing. Rick.
You gotta come off mute, Rick.
Thank you. I said, Sarah, this is wonderful. The little bit of personal history just for fun. We had an oil spill, massive. Our tank blew out
Oh.
in our home in Needham at a time when we were thinking we had outgrown the home and we were going to sell it. Needless to say, after a year of remediation and ozoning and everything else and digging 10 feet into the ground, we did not sell it. We held on to it. But the question that came up then was, and this had to be on the, I don't know, the deed or something, there had to be something flagging this. The question that came up for us then comes up for me again now, which is how long, and I think you were just kind of addressing it in your remarks about, every 5 years you have to look again because there's new technology. There's also, I assume, new understanding of how great each individual risk may or may not be. I mean, it's just enormously complicated. So to simplify the question, I would say this, I would ask this, does regulation in general not give you, if once it's deemed to have no significant risk, is that for the life of the owner's franchise on the property until they sell it, at which point then a buyer might run into the need to, or a seller might run into the need to have it once again inspected and deemed at a higher level? Or is it, how does that work? I'm not asking the question.
Yeah, no, I totally get what you're saying. And there's probably 3 points to mention about this. One being your oil tank issue. Here in Natick a number of years ago in the Weathersfield area, which is over near Bennett Hemingway School in that area, though many of those houses are slab ranches that were built with no basements, so they're on slabs, and they had underground fuel oil tanks because that saved room. They could make the house, they didn't have to put a room in the house for the tanks. And many decades ago now, the tanks started deteriorating and people were having your situation where their tanks ruptured, contaminated soil was there. There was this one picture I will never forget of this poor gentleman who his contractor had come in and was excavating contaminated soil, and the contamination extended under his slab, and they were excavating under the slab with no shoring, no nothing. Oh, no. And this is picture of this poor guy standing at his front door looking out in this giant hole that extended under where he was standing, and people were going bankrupt. It was a terrible, terrible situation. People were taking their life savings because insurance didn't cover it, and taking their life savings for this. So the state of Massachusetts actually, because of the situation in Natick, wrote some particular pieces of the regulations dealing with residential underground heating oil tanks. But to your question about liability going forward. So you were getting at something that I think you may have been getting at, a thing called an activity and use limitation, which goes on the deed and it runs with the land. So so back to the risk characterization of does it pose, have you gotten to this condition of no significant risk? No significant, when you're making that determination, you have to consider all reasonable future uses of the land. And if it only meets that condition under a subset of all future reasonable uses, then you can, under certain circumstances, say you're done, but you have to put a deed restriction on the property saying, for instance, this piece of property is okay for everything except maybe growing fruits and vegetables for human consumption, or letting children dig in the dirt, or whatever condition flunks your test of no significant risk. If you are not addressing that condition by cleaning it up, you then have to address it by putting a deed restriction on the property saying the property owner agrees not to do that thing. And there's typically, from just about every activity and use limitation I have ever written myself as an LSP or read that somebody else did, there's always a section in there that says if for some reason you do want to do these things that are forbidden under the terms of the AUL, you need to first get an LSP to come in and guide you in doing it. They have to provide a health and safety plan for the people that are going to be doing the digging. They have to provide a soil management plan for how you're going to deal with the contaminated soil. They have to do all this stuff such that people aren't going in there willy-nilly and doing a problem. And if you were then selling the property, and this pertains more to a commercial property, again, back to the whole issue of lenders and their their neck being on the line. The lender, even if you're just refinancing, if you own the property but you want to remortgage it and refinance it, your lender is still going to require that assessment to be updated. So, I mean, there were properties that I assessed 5 times over my career, just as the owner, every 5 years they'd refinance their property. And we'd assess it each time because you don't necessarily know, it might have been clean in 2015, but maybe in 2017, something fell off the loading dock, a drum full of something and split open. And, so you need to go back through and reassess it. And the assessment involves looking at the history of the property, if possible, back to virgin land. It looks at who all the occupants have been. It looks at what they have done, potentially actually drilling and collecting soil and groundwater samples. So depending on, it's kind of like when you go to the doctor. If you go to the doctor for a physical, they're going to ask you your medical history. They're going to ask you, do you have any conditions that you're aware of? They're going to do some general screening. They're going to do your blood pressure and your pulse and your dissolved oxygen levels and that stuff.
Questions.
And
Yeah.
I'll get to the questions in just a sec. And maybe if you're, and you're in great health and you're just going in for a physical and you don't have any complaints, they might say you're done. But if you go in and you say, oh my God, doc, I've been throwing up every day and I've got splitting headaches and I can't walk and I've got all these horrible conditions, the doctor's going to go through a bunch of tests. He might send you for he might send you for an x-ray, or he might have you have a bunch of blood work done, or, there's depending on what you tell him. And again, back to Bill's point, some of this comes down to cost. You could walk into the doctor for a physical, and the doctor could order a CAT scan and an MRI and 17 x-rays and every piece of blood work known to mankind, but that would cost $1 gazillion, and it's just not practical. It certainly would give the doctor a lot of information, but if you tested every human being that comes in the door for every one of the hundreds of blood tests, it's just not a way to do it. So looking at property is kind of that way, but it will get reassessed on an ongoing basis. And I will let Doug figure out whose question to take first.
Peter is up first, then Brian, then Tom.
Okay.
So Peter.
So are people able to hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good. First of all, thank you. I think it's been a fascinating exposition of what otherwise is a very opaque and somewhat obscure topic. So I'd kind of like your opinion on this. Some of us may have noticed that the Conservation Law Foundation recently sued the Environmental Protection Agency, the federal authority, over the condition of the Charles, Neponset, and Mystic rivers with regard to pollution issues, which immediately raised a flag in my line of sight because, as Brian knows, a small group of us have been looking very carefully.
Oops, Peter, you suddenly went on mute.
Is
There you
that
go.
all right?
Looking very carefully, we lost you.
So as Brian knows, a group of us have been looking very carefully at Conchituate State Park in terms of its condition and its uses. And we've pretty much come to the conclusion that Cochituate Lake, which is really 3 lakes, but Cochituate Lake is polluted to a fare thee well with both organic and inorganic substances. And along with the Sudbury River, and to a lesser extent, the Charles River. So if you follow that logic path and look at what happened across the street from Lake Cochituate at Springvale, and we all know Springvale is the central filtration facility for the town of Natick's water supply. One could move to the reasonable conclusion that the watersheds themselves that surround Lake Cochituate, along with specific points, pollution points, point-specific pollution, i.e. All the septic systems along Lake Cochituate on the Natick side, all the industrial sites that are in a constant state of pollution because of the extent, have literally polluted both the Charles and the Sudbury aquifers. Are you following me so far?
Yep.
So my obvious question here, or the self-apparent question is, should the EPA be taking a look? And by the way, I forgot, we all know the town of Wayland has been drinking bottled water now for, I think, over a year or 2 years. Am I correct in that?
I have not been following the situation in Wayland as closely as I probably should. So
Yeah.
I think you're right, but I
Yeah.
don't know for sure.
Well, I mean, Wayland is just thousands of miles away from Natick, we all know, as are all the other
Got
communities.
the level 10 force field, Peter.
Yeah. So what's odd about that, by the way, is this kind of separate silos phenomenon where none of us really know what's going on with regard to environmental remediation. But to the point, should the town of Natick and surrounding towns be talking to the EPA about doing a comprehensive analysis of pollution in these towns or this region?
Whether it's the EPA or the DEP, I think the initial place to go would be to the state, because the Massachusetts regulatory program is pretty strong. In fact, Massachusetts was kind of a model for a number of other states that have followed in a lot of their regulatory approaches to things. But to your broader question, absolutely the way to look at this is on a watershed basis, because watersheds don't do political boundaries. So absolutely the way to go is on a watershed basis, and the state has started doing that. They started doing that, oh gosh, 8 or 10 years ago, maybe longer. They started doing that on the base at least for the piece of water usage. In other words, rather than regulating by the way of saying this town can have that many gallons of water that they can withdraw in that town, they need to look at what can the whole watershed support. That's why, again, back to issues with drinking bottled water or reduction in water availability. When the whole PFAS issue came up, we had to switch our blend of the sources in town where the water came from. We had to use more water from the Elm Bank wells than we typically do. And we had that hard, really very significant water ban the previous summer, I think 2021, I think, because of the way the state regulates the Elm Bank supply relative to the flow in the Charles River. And that those wells, when they're really cranking in the summer, can actually suck the river dry. And so that there's a different water withdrawal number for the summer than for the winter when there's more water around. So absolutely the way to look is watershed wide. The issue of the whole aquifer being contaminated, broadly, that's true, but it is not the case that at every point in the aquifer it's contaminated. So in other words, there are a number of, there's sorry to be kind of rambling on this answer. There's a lot to it. So there's broadly two large categories of pollution. There's point source, which is company X had a tank that ruptured or spilled a drum of something, or there was a leak in a pipe inside the building and it leaked under the slab, or, you know, something that you can say, this came from this one place. And then there's non-point sources, which are things like runoff from highways, or runoff from when people have lawn chemicals put on, things that occur over a large area, and you can't go back to one particular place and say it all came from here. It's low levels but broad, so it all adds up to a bunch of stuff, whereas a point source is more typically a local place but a higher concentration. So either they're both an issue, and always environmental regulations, any kind of regulations really, they sort of start out going after the low-hanging fruit. And the low-hanging fruit initially was the point sources. You know, we can go and say, this place is a problem, we can try to deal with it. And one way we try to deal with it is by establishing aquifer protection zones, or aquifer overlay districts. There's various names for them. The state regulates groundwater differently in areas that are aquifers. They're held to a much stricter standard. Everywhere that is considered an existing or potential drinking water source area must meet groundwater drinking water quality at every point.
Sarah, let me interject very quickly. Is there someone within DEP, either by name or by title, that we should be talking to?
I have been away from dealing with DEP for a few years. I'd be happy to look into that.
If you would, that would be very
I'd be
valuable.
happy to do that. DEP had a big reorganization a few years ago. One of these things where they were, what do they call it, the golden parachute, where they're trying to reduce costs, and they offered early buyouts, and a number of their senior staff left. They lost
Sarah,
a huge brain trust.
why don't you and I take this, or you, me, and Brian take this offline and pursue it?
Sure.
I mean,
That sounds good.
Yeah, I'd be
And,
happy to.
Brian's up next with a question. I know, Brian, you put something in the chat too. And
yeah, that was just a link to the League of Conservation voter input page, which is the Murrah Healy administration webpage asking for input.
that's cool.
So, but I just want to share my experience on a little different perspective about this whole conversation, which is a carpenter builder. I moved to Massachusetts in '84, and a couple of years later, I became a licensed construction supervisor. And it was mostly residential work in this general area, and I ended up doing a bit of commercial work. But at that point in time, you were encouraged to be licensed and maintain a insurance and liability and become legit. And along with that, you were required for a continuing education, which they brought it. Well, that didn't start at the early part of the licensing program. That was probably about a decade later. But their initial focus was asbestos and lead.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point in time, also OSHA was making its presence known by inspecting sites for safety and everything. So everybody was pretty cautious to be in the right track and effort. But it was costly and slowed down the process, and a lot of the efforts became nonsensical in a lot of ways, with the lead abatement and stuff, that your final test was a wipe with a baby wipe to show dust. And then all those contaminants that were created by de-leading and removing the asbestos was thrown in the dumpster, just to the general trash pile. And the economic penalty that by participating in those programs was substantial. And so a lot of people said, don't ask, don't tell, move forward. And that has magnified itself to the point where you're having all these local houses in the past few years being sold without even getting an inspection,
Mhm.
you know. And it's the heated up economy and the lack of enforcement for these types of efforts where people are saying, you know, this house has got a bunch of asbestos in the cellar, and we'll just make it disappear and upgrade this. And that's happened a lot around here from my guess and participation probably in some of it and in some various points. But, you know, that focus and effort that was brought into play in the 90s now has kind of dwindled to a secondary thing, and you find projects that probably should have been really worked with the asbestos abatement and stuff that bam, they've happened. It's gone. There's nobody coming out to say, what happened to that asbestos roof? It just disappeared. The conversation isn't had, and life goes on. And so that ability to kind of jump the shark, I think, is a big, important part of the responsibility of the community. And nobody wants to be the bad guy to point out the neighbor and say, they just, hauled away all that asbestos without even doing any remedial action. So, that focus and efforts, I think, is kind of a look at this while down here, oh, we just jumped the shark, and you keep looking at this and talking about this, and we'll just and here we are.
Mhm.
That it's a lot of this stuff, the long-term effects of lead and asbestos compared to salt and PFAS, I think, are going to pale in comparison in another decade when we start looking back at this and trying to dig our way out. In the meantime, here we are talking about the solvents and everything that get dumped into commercial sites, and a lot of the stuff even happens in our own backyards.
Yep.
People dumping out their brake fluids and cleaning products. And so, I really do think a lot of it is focus and energy where they find an easy and maybe a segment that's easy to capitalize.
Yep.
Where these abatement crews and companies, they used to be a big roaring entity, a lot of people getting their businesses going, and now it's kind of slid into these concentrated efforts of larger corporate efforts, I think.
Yep.
that
Yeah, I
Jay,
mean,
Brian, Dave.
you're touching on a lot of good points, Brian. And so I guess a couple things I'll say about that. Again, a lot of it comes down to human nature. It is more expensive, and people, if they can find a way to avoid spending the money, they generally will. So the hammer you hold over them to get them to spend the money is regulation and enforcement. And if there's not a lot of enforcement going on, and again, this is, you can see this of, are the state police out on the pike keeping you from going 80 miles an hour? If they're not, people go 80 miles an hour. It's the way the world works. So you're absolutely right that people absolutely are cutting corners. In terms of just lost my train of thought. In terms of solvents and what have you, I mean, there is an incredible, amazing resource that the state of Massachusetts has to look up any reported site in the state and see every report, all the correspondence. You can find out, I mean, when I sit down and get back together with Peter and so forth, and look at this, any company in the watershed that you're interested in, we can look them up and see if they're in the system. So there is a way to track all that. There was something else I was going to say about this, and
The
I'm sorry, I
ambiguous
lost my
nature
train
of that, if you would, I think there was the Evergreen community on Contituate had
Yep.
a real high incidence of cancer in that community, and they were trying to dig into that. And they said, wow, you know, this is a multi-headed hydra that we aren't capable of really digging too far into it. And that was kind of dropped.
Yeah, it's
And,
very incredibly hard to prove a cancer cluster. It is, first off, you've got to get a regulator to take it on, to agree to look into it. But because the nature of many carcinogenic exposures is it takes a long time from the time you get exposed until you're diagnosed with cancer. It can take decades.
it's life.
So it's very, very difficult to prove that, you know, because people move around, they're exposed occupationally to things. There's all kinds of different things that can happen. And to go through and really be able to document, there's actually a higher incidence of cancer in this neighborhood. And hey, the kinds of cancer that people have can be caused by this stuff that's in their drinking water or that they're breathing. I mean, another thing that became a huge issue a few years ago, and it's not because it was a new issue, it was because people figured out that it was an issue and hadn't really thought about it before, is if you have contaminated groundwater under your property, vapors from that contamination can come up into your building, especially in the winter when your heating system is drawing in air to run the heater, and you get a negative pressure into your home, and you could be breathing all kinds of nasty vapors. And that's an issue. And again, people didn't know that years ago. Part of the problem is we're always playing catch up. You know, it's always, we create some chemical, we say, hey, this is great, we can use this in 97 places. That's why PFAS is everywhere. They're super useful. And PCBs are everywhere because they were super useful. Asbestos, the reason that there's asbestos everywhere is if you go back into the 1800s, there were, I mean, here in Natick, our whole downtown burned down in 1874. There was a giant fire. The whole downtown burned. And this was a common occurrence. And it kind of followed a similar track to what we're doing with the environment. You know, as buildings got bigger and so forth, and when there was a fire, it was more of a problem. People said, hey, this is a problem. Our downtown is burning down. We got to do something about it. And they passed a whole bunch of regulations. And every time, Doug was reminding me this morning, this is the 80th anniversary of the big Coconut Grove fire in Boston. It was like 485 people or something burned to death in a big fire at a nightclub. And every time a horrible disaster like that happens, people would say, we need to fix this. We need new regulations. And so they created, you know, fireproof doors and smoke detectors and sprinklers. And one of the things they did was put asbestos everywhere as a fireproofing. And originally they didn't know it was a problem. And then down the line, it's like, hey, a lot of those people that worked in the shipyards putting asbestos on ships, or contractors, people that worked in the asbestos mines, hey, look at that, they're all coming down with lung cancer. I wonder if there's a connection. And those people that worked in the mines would come home with asbestos dust all over their clothes and spread it all over their house, and their kids would breathe it, and their kids are coming down with cancer. And so now we say, oh, now we have this problem. But like the high school that Doug and I graduated from, it opened in 1973, loaded with asbestos, because that was state of the practice in those days, to put asbestos everywhere. So then, after the building had been open 1 year, it was in the mid-70s, this is when people were learning that, hey, asbestos is an issue. The city of Newton spent, I don't know, $3 million even in the 70s to remove all the asbestos. It just, unfortunately, it's a long learning curve, and we're always playing catch up. You know, I'm sure there's something new being invented today that in 15 years we're going to say, look what we did.
Can we get to Tom?
Yeah, sorry. I get on a rant, I apologize.
Tom, you've been very patient. You have a question? You come off mute.
Yep. It's a very simple question. So you talked about temporary things are being done when it's reviewed every 5 years. I'm assuming that the temporary is get you to a point where it's not significant.
Yes. So to even get to the point where you say you're at a temporary solution, you need to get to a point where there is not, what's the term? There's sort of multiple levels of risk a site poses. There's an imminent hazard, which means you need to deal with this absolutely immediately, fence it off so nobody can go in there or something. And then before you get to no significant risk, there's an intermediate stage, which the acronym I'm forgetting, but it's basically substantial hazard. That's it. So you have to prove there's no substantial hazard before you can even say you're at the temporary state. So you were a little muffled, Tom, but if I understand the gist of your question, it was effectively, how bad is it if somebody's at a temporary state? Are they still causing a problem? And you do have to enter the phase of temporary solution. You do have to document that basically what you are required to do is, for the final, to totally get out of the system and be done, you have to show no significant risk for the foreseeable future. So kind of forever. But for the temporary status, you have to show no significant risk for the 5 years until your next review. So you do have to, maybe you have to have gotten your treatment to a certain point. Maybe you have to fence off an area to keep people out of it. Maybe you have to pave something over to keep people from digging. You may have to do something to kind of stabilize it a bit, to be considered that, at least for now, this is not hurting anybody and we're going to keep at it. So I hope that was the gist of your question. As I say, you were a little muffled, but
Yes, that was. Thank you.
okay.
We also have a question from the chat, from Rick. Is there any present liability to septic systems if you live in a watershed overlay?
That's a good question. I believe the answer is no. Beyond, you are not supposed to put, wherever you are, you're not supposed to put anything other than, stuff from your kitchen sink or your toilet. You're not supposed to, pour your waste oil down your septic system or something like that. But beyond that, there isn't. In terms of new construction in an overlay district, that I would have to go back and look at what our particular overlay district requires. I haven't actually read Natick's aquifer overlay district thing for a while. It's been a while since I did a site in Natick, so I don't remember it off the top of my head. I did look into it at times when I was working on some properties here in Natick, but I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the details. But
Right.
there are also there are just separately from that, there's also Title V regulations having to do with septic systems, such that, for instance, if your house is on septic and you're you're going to sell it, the new buyer has a right, if there needs to be an inspection done, and the new buyer can say, for instance, your leaching field is basically failed and you need to replace it. Or, they can, at the time of property transfers, the septic system will get upgraded. But in terms of not being on septic at all, if there's no sewer on the street, you kind of don't have a choice. So certainly that's something that any town, in my opinion, should be focusing on. I mean, there are really small towns, there's no sewer anywhere. But as a town is developing, certainly the priority in terms of putting in sewer should be to protect areas that are most likely to be harmed by the septic system. And I guess the other thing I'll say about septic systems is the typically the threat or the problem that a septic system poses is nitrates, which are effectively fertilizer. When you go to the store and you buy fertilizer for your lawn or garden or whatever, there's nitrogen, there's phosphorus, and there's potassium. Those are kind of the big three compounds.
It's always greener over the septic
It's
tank.
always greener over the septic tank, said Irma Bombeck. But so that's what tends to get through the system. The various bacteria and that kind of stuff a well-designed septic system is not going to be pouring bacteria into a local water body. But what will come through is nitrate. Nitrates are extremely mobile in groundwater. And so now there are, if you, for instance, if somebody's putting in a development where there'll be multiple houses on septic, there can be a requirement that they actually have to put in a little pre-treatment plant that will deal with the nitrate issue. So again, we're always playing catch up. We've learned to do this for new development, but the old ones we're still working on. So
real quick, a word of caution to anyone whose offspring might be buying with septic. And again, in Needham, we lived 2 doors from a stream that fed down into a water reservoir. And the house we bought was built in 1932. I have no idea what was there before. It was near Babson. Babson's on a hill, etc. Well, we found out when our septic system needed replacing, the town suddenly said, well, you can't, you don't have any more room, which I thought at the time was meant either I didn't understand how much room they take, or I was just running into a regulation. Anyway, I didn't make a fuss about it, but we ended up having to pay for the town sewer to be extended on our street and go around to neighbors' knocks and say doors and knock and say, hey, wouldn't you like to share the cost of getting us, so this problem doesn't happen to you? Yep. And we got some very polite, well, not now, thank yous. So, fast forward to this past summer, I'm on the Connecticut River in Connecticut, looking at a property with my sister-in-law for her niece. And that's when I realized that there's no sewer in this town whatsoever. And people are all around the little rivers and streams that feed the Connecticut at the mouth of the Connecticut River. And it's all septic. Mm-hmm. And, so I don't know what one would do with that as a buyer, but I would like to know personally, if I were putting money into a property, which she's looking at, I'd like to know where that might lead,
Yeah, I mean, as you say, if there is no sewer, you kind of don't have a choice. I mean, I totally sympathize. We used to own property in Bellingham. We went to sell it. The septic system didn't pass. We had to replace the leach field. And so we spent a lot of money upgrading the septic system, making it all nice and shiny and new to comply with Title V. And like a couple months after the work was done, we got a notice from the town of Bellingham. Hey, we're thinking of putting sewer on the street. Would you like to sign up? And I was like, So we would have been one of those people who would have said, no, thanks. We already spent $1 gazillion fixing this. But in terms of your question about so 2 things along a site, any site that goes into, if you're within a certain distance of any water body that feeds into a drinking water reservoir, they're regulated more tightly. But again, this is new construction. But there are all kinds of rules about, I looked at a site in Southborough years and years ago, big undeveloped piece of wooded property off Route 9, or on a side road off Route 9. And my assignment was figure out if you can put a septic, like a one septic plant for the whole development on this property. Well, the whole property was on the side of a hill. It was all rocky. There was no permeable soil to put the leach field except down at the bottom of the hill. But down at the bottom of the hill ran a stream that went into the big reservoir system out there on Route 9. And the only place it would have worked hydrologically to have the material infiltrate into the soil was within this restriction distance to the stream. So the answer was, you may have 20-something acres of land, but you can't develop it because there's no place you can put a workable septic system within the regulatory program. As far as I know, I haven't been by there for a few years now, but for many, many years, that property sat as woods. I don't know if maybe they put sewer on the street since then.
Sarah, could I ask a question that's a little bit more immediate to Natick? We believe that along the eastern shore of Lake Cochituate, there are any number of septic systems servicing individual households where the town has not extended sewage systems into the neighborhood. And based on what I've just heard from you, there's the distinct possibility that a whole wave of nitrates regularly infiltrate Lake Cochituate. I mention that because Lake Cochituate, which is a primary source of recreational activity for ethnic minorities and others who quite strangely don't own vacation homes or the Cape in New Hampshire or Maine. Can you imagine that
What a
happening to
surprise.
anyone? The lake is basically closed to activity summer after summer after summer. So what is the town, does the town monitor these septic fields at all on a regular basis?
I'm sorry, my husband was whispering in my ear. Can you repeat the last sentence?
Does the town monitor these septic systems along the eastern shore of Lake Cochituate on a regular basis?
Not to my knowledge. The Board of Health is the group that is in charge of dealing with septic
Thank you.
systems.
Thank you.
But I do not know. I mean, I'd be happy to look into it, but I don't, as far as I know, they don't monitor it. And I also have not looked into this enough to know off the top of my head the whole regulatory interface.
Can I interrupt real quick? Sorry, I'm just noticing that Bill has to run. And Bill, I wanted to give you the opportunity to invite people Sunday.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, the First Congregational Church of Natick is having a program this Sunday about environmental justice, and we wanted to invite folks here. This is not limited to the church. It's at 12 o'clock. And we have a minister from our conference whose specialty is environmental and climate justice and economic justice, excuse me. Everyone is welcome. If you'd like to, just come to the church and go in the door by the parking lot around noon, and we'll be somebody there to greet you. Love to have you join us. Thanks, Doug.
Thanks for that, Bill. I know you had to run, but
Thank you, Bill.
Peter's comment about yeah, climate justice is
Yeah,
is
I was
involved in this, yeah.
going to say, Peter, you're entering a whole new topic, which could be an entire Coffee with a Purpose session is environmental justice, which I didn't touch on, but certainly everything that I've been discussing this morning hits in the environmental justice field. If you want to look at the distribution of really nasty hazardous waste sites and overlay that with the distribution of brown and black and low income populations, you'll get a really nice correlation. So yeah, it's environmental justice is a topic that we could spend all day on. But in terms of the question about the town inspecting the sewage, the septic systems, the Lake Cochituate is state property, and I do not know the regulatory interface between what the town deals with and what the state deals with. Again, it's something I'm sure I could find out, but I don't know whether the town identifies those properties as a high priority based on their proximity to the lake. It's not something I've looked into, so I can't answer your question, but I'd be happy to try to figure it out.
I got some work for you, Sarah. I got a lot of work for you.
Sounds like it. Well, so I would like to thank Sarah for stepping into the breach here and giving us this talk. I do want to let folks know that the next two Mondays are still open on the calendar. We're hoping to get it speakers for the Natick Affordable Housing Trust.